Hello Steelers, and welcome to this video in which I'm going to go through the steps of painting three 15mm figures representing the major combatants of the Vietnam War. That is, the People's Army of Vietnam, the Viet Cong and the US Army. You can use the steps here for the US Army to also paint the United States Marine Corps and also the Army of Republic of Vietnam, as there's very few differences in their kit. I'm not going to be painting the Tiger Stripes camouflage, and this is just the normal basic jungle gear that the US Army wore. The Vietnam War lasted for approximately 20 years from 1955 through to 1975, and it was actually fought in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, and it drew in numerous countries on the communist and anti-communist sides. Beginning after the fall of French Indochina, the war split Vietnam into the Communist North and the Republic South. Originally entering Vietnam as advisors and support teams, American forces took a major role in the latter part of the war, with troops on the ground heading anti-communist nations, while the People's Army of Vietnam faced them on the ground with support from the Viet Cong guerrilla fighters. It's difficult to pin down casualty numbers, but the US suffered over 58,000 casualties, whilst the people of Vietnam, both North and South, suffered heavily with somewhere between 791,000 and 1,141,000 civilian and military deaths. It was an incredibly complex conflict, and was the major conflict of the Cold War, fought as a proxy between the powers of the West and the communist blocs of the East. For the first time, live TV pictures of combat were beamed into people's homes in the US, and many war crimes were carried out by both sides, with American massacres at My Lai for example, and the mistreatment of POWs by the North Vietnamese. It was also a vastly unpopular war, with frequent anti-war demonstrations being held across America, and its legacy of buried munitions and mines have killed over 42,000 people since the war ended, and it continued to do so this day. From a wargamer's perspective of understanding the war, we can explore the rich history baked into the conflict by examining the big differences between the two main belligerents, the North Vietnamese and the US forces, with their asymmetric methods of fighting. Several rule sets are available for gaming the period, but I'll be using Charlie Don't Surf by the Two Fat Lardies. Now anyway, let's get to painting. I will take each figure individually, but first I base them all the same. These will be big men for Charlie Don't Surf, so they are on larger than usual bases, but obviously use whatever bases you need for your rule set. I apply super glue to the base and I stand the figure up in it. I then spray AC accelerator on to harden the glue quickly. For the US forces, I begin by painting the figures in white prime, just using Vallejo white. In fact, I do this with all the figures, so I'm going to skip this later for the NVA and the VC figures. Also, I'll put a list of the paints in the description down below with an Amazon affiliate link that gives me a bit of a kickback. The next step is to paint the basic uniform in block colours. For the Americans, I'm using Vallejo's Russian World War II uniform. This may seem a little odd, but it gives the tunics and trousers that nice faded green colour. I use a medium sized brush and I just get this on quickly, making sure to cover any white. At this point I don't worry about any overspill because we're going to be painting over later anyway. When the uniform is dry, I paint the flesh tones. This guy is Caucasian, so I'm using Vallejo's sunny skin tone. The US Army in Vietnam was the first integrated army in US history, so you can use other tones to paint African American and Latino men to mix up the look of the squads. For this, I use a small brush and I try not to get any paint on the uniform. The helmet base colour is then painted next, and for this I'm using Vallejo's olive drab. I'll paint in the camouflage later, so this is all that's needed at this step. The grunts humped a lot of equipment across the jungles of Vietnam, and these chaps are no exception. The material would fade quickly in the heat and the extreme weather and the climate of the area, so for this I use Vallejo's hemp. This offers a nice contrast to the green of the uniform, but without getting too stark. I paint the webbing, packs and gaiters of the figure in this colour. The boots are painted next in Vallejo black, along with the M16 assault rifle. This was made of aluminium alloy, steel and plastic, all of which were blackened, so black works perfectly well for this at this scale. And that is a basic block colouring done. So I paint the base in Vallejo's flat earth, just to be useful as a base for the static grass that I'm going to be adding later on. Then, once everything is dry, I turn to the tried and tested Agrax earth shade as a wash over the entire figure. I use a medium sized brush and I draw out any areas where the wash pulls in the recesses. If you want, you could leave the figure here as they look grand when they're dry, but I move on to highlighting after the Agrax has dried. For highlighting, I use the same basic colours that I used in the block painting. So, for the flesh, I go back with Vallejo's sunny skin tone and using a tiny brush highlight the raised areas of the forehead, nose and cheeks, along with the arms and the hands. Then I do similar with the Russian uniform along the creases and the flat area of the tunic and also the trousers. I also highlight the helmet cover and the front edge in olive drab. And then, you guessed it, I use hemp to highlight the webbing, the packs and gaiters. Pretty simple stuff, eh? With the figure so small, there's little point in doing the camo on the helmet in any great detail, so I use chocolate brown in small patches using a small brush, before adding reflective green patches to create an impression of camo at tabletop distance. Finally, I varnish the figures using Winsor & Newton's Matte Professional Artist Spray and I paint PVA glue onto the base, over which I then sprinkle static grass. I don't use an applicator here, as blowing on the grass before it has dried will help the grass stand up anyway. And then finally, as the jungle is full of plants, I add some grass tufts to the base, just to break up the shape. So now we turn to the People's Army of North Vietnam, or the NVA as they are commonly called in the West. With the figure primed in white, just like the US Infantry, I begin with blocking in the uniform, and for this I'm using US Olive Drab, once again by Vallejo. For this figure I'm doing with the later greenish colour. The earlier uniform was more khaki looking. With the uniform colour dry, I paint the flesh. Vietnamese skin tone is slightly darker than Caucasian skin, so for this I'm using Vallejo's tan yellow. It has a nice dark tone that isn't too dark. The helmet is then just painted in Vallejo's German camouflage dark green. The PAVN also carried a lot of equipment into the field, and this is shown on these figures in the form of backpacks and ammo pouches. For these I paint German camo beige, using a smallish brush for the details of the straps. And then we go back to black for the boots and also the metal parts of the AK-47 assault rifle. The stocks and the forend of the AK-47 were manufactured in wood, so for these parts I paint them in beige brown. And that's it for the block painting, apart from painting the base in flat earth, again like the US figure. Once this has dried, I once again apply the magic of Agrax wash, using the same as before with a medium brush and making sure that the wash doesn't pool too much in the recesses. And then once again, after the Agrax has dried completely, I begin the highlighting process. This starts with the tan yellow on the face and the hands, only hitting those raised areas and again with a small brush. I then move on to the uniform and using the olive drab I go over the creases and the flat areas. This will give it some nice definition, especially with that Agrax wash. I think you've probably got the gist now, but I also paint the helmet raised areas in German camo dark green again. And then I finish off the fellow with the highlights of German camo beige on the webbing and the equipment pouches. Once this stage is complete, I varnish the figure and base it the same way that I did with the US Infantry. And then finally we move on to the easiest of the three to paint, and these are the Viet Cong local forces. These men and women didn't have a uniform as such, and generally wore the black clothes of the local peasants, which were dubbed derogatorily as black pyjamas by the US forces. As these fighters were operating as guerrillas, they wore clothing that wouldn't make them stick out like a sore thumb. So, for this, I begin by painting the figure's clothing in all black by Vallejo. I also paint the metal parts of the weapon, in this case it's an SKS Soviet rifle, and I also paint shoes as well. I then turn to the flesh, and just like the PAVN, I use the tan yellow by Vallejo for this. I paint the face and the hands and the arm, if they're showing. The equipment was mostly Soviet, and similar to what the PAVN were using, so I paint it the same as the PAVN soldier earlier. That is, in German camo beige. I do this with a small brush just to ensure that the straps are painted neatly. The typical peasant hat that this figure is wearing is painted in Vallejo's dark sand. Similar to the AK-47, the SKS had wooden parts, and I paint these using Vallejo's beige brown and a small brush. And then almost as soon as we have begun, the block colouring is completed. I finish it off once again with a flat earth on the base and I let the figure dry. Cracking out the Agrax once again, I splash it all over and ensure that it is spread evenly across the figure. I begin the highlighting stage with the flesh once again using the tan yellow of the base colour, again just hitting those raised areas of the faces, hands and arms. The second highlight is the equipment and the webbing, which is once again painted using the Vallejo German camo beige. Then the final step of the highlight is the peasant hat, which I very lightly dry brush with dark sand and an old brush. As previously, I varnish and base the figures the same way as they're all fighting in the same theatre, and then that's them complete. Obviously, I've only painted one figure from each here, but if you paint a number of them at the same time using these quick techniques, you'll soon have plenty of men completed for fighting in the jungles of Vietnam. So, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please leave a like and a comment and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next Storm of Steel video.